Our guest today on Personally Speaking is a regular. Our guest today on Personally Speaking is a regular columnist for the New York Times, but he's also written a great new book called Believe. His name is Ross Douthat, and he is someone who's with us on Personally Speaking. Please stay tuned. Hello and welcome to Personally Speaking. I'm your host, Monsignor Jim Lisante, and renowned New York Times columnist and acclaimed author and cultural commentator Ross Douthat joins me now. Ross has been a New York Times opinion columnist since April of 2009, and he is the film critic for the National Review. Previously, he was a senior editor at The Atlantic. Ross's latest book is called Believe, and the subtitle is Why Everyone Should Be Religious. His book is for everyone, from those who are devoutly religious to those who are agnostic and everyone in between. Ross presents a compelling argument about how religion helps us to understand the universe and our place within it, and offers a perspective on why faith can not only be more fulfilling than skepticism, but provides a guide for the seeker looking to move from uncertainty into belief. Ross shares his own personal faith journey and his embrace of the Catholic faith. He lives with his wife and 5 children in New Haven, Connecticut. He's here with us today to talk about belief and the Catholic faith and the values that matter the most to him. Joining me now, I'm so pleased to welcome to Personally Speaking, Ross Douthat. I'd like to thank Ross for being with us. And to begin with, before we talk about Believe, his great new book, Ross, I want to get it right. So it's Douthat. Am I right?
As long as you get the Tao right, Father, to be
Okay.
honest with you, the last people say Douthat, Douthit, Douthut. It's all acceptable. You just have to get that it's like the Dow Jones.
Right, right. That much
It's
I can
not
do.
it's not French. It's like, Northern English. It was probably Douthwaite originally.
Okay.
It's never been Douthat or anything pretentious like that.
Does it mean anything in particular?
It means, ruin for my children who have to have the name
Right.
pronounced. I don't think it has any special meaning. There is like a Douthwaite Vale somewhere in Yorkshire that when we went to England, we did not make it to, but
Okay.
on the next trip, maybe we'll make the journey.
When people come to me, they'll say, Monsignor Lisante, what does Lisante mean? And I stretch it by saying it means the saint, but I know it doesn't mean that. Now, let me ask you, because I think the book is great, and I hope our listeners and watchers get it and read it. But the issue that comes up for me as a priest in a parish with 3,000 families, time and time again, is the younger people who will say, especially in planning their wedding, we don't want it to be too religious, because actually, Father, I'm really more a spiritual person than religious, and you certainly address that. Where did this great divide between the religious and the spiritual come? It seems to me that as a religious person, I better be spiritual, or what's the point?
Yeah, I think that category that people use serves two distinct purposes. I think for a long time it was a way station for people who were leaving religion but
Right.
didn't want to fully admit it. People who might have been raised Catholic and wanted to make their parents happy by getting married in the Catholic Church, but didn't want, too many of the specific commitments that come with actually belonging.
Yeah.
Nowadays, though, I think you have a slightly different category, which is that it's almost a way station on the way into faith.
Okay.
Because part of, I think, and this is part of the reason why I wrote this book the way I did, I think we've reached a point in American society where, for really the first time in our history, we have a large number of people, especially in the younger generations, who have no direct experience of religion at all. So it's not that they were raised and fell away. It's not even that, they had parents who were that they did the Christmas and Easter thing and, know the Christmas pageant and things like that, right? No, we're talking about people who have never been inside a church, have never
Mm,
opened a Bible, and have picked up their knowledge of religion from, the internet, peers, various sources, but have no direct experience of it at all. And so I think often people in that category, when they take an interest in religious matters and ideas, and I think more of them are now than were 10 or 15 years ago. I don't think we have a religious revival happening, but I think we have what you might call a renewed interest in religion.
Yeah.
It's very natural to say, okay, well, I'm interested in this stuff, but I'm certainly not going to go all the way to becoming Roman Catholic, or
Right.
for that matter, Presbyterian or Sunni Muslim or anything else, right? It's more natural to say, well, I'm doing exploratory work, right? And that exploratory work makes me, as you say, spiritual, but not religious. And part of what I'm doing in the book is trying to effectively reach out to some of those people and pull them a little bit further in, you might say.
Right. And for those who are watching and listening, I think the subtitle is really important. It's not just believe, but why everyone should be religious. Let me ask you too, because you and I are having this conversation in the midst of the seemingly near death of Pope Francis,
Yep.
and yet people of every faith. I look on religious news service, which takes in all sorts of religions, and those who have no faith at all seem to be caring about this man, praying for this man, hoping he makes it. Has he been able to, in your mind, uh, pull everyone into the sense of it doesn't matter what particular religion you belong to. It matters that a man is a spiritual leader, a moral leader, and therefore we care about him. Why is he having this impact on people of all religions and no religion at all?
I mean, I'll be perfectly honest, and in being perfectly honest, will be a slightly implied critique of his predecessor, and I should say that identify as a more conservative Catholic and generally was closer to Pope Benedict than to Pope Francis. I think in the various degrees of difference one has within Catholicism, but I think that the fact that a pope lives and dies as a spiritual father
Mm.
is tremendously important to the witness of the office and the witness of the church. And of course, yes, people are praying for the Holy Father to recover, but they're also praying for him. There's sort of obviously an acceptance that he might very well pass away. If he doesn't pass away this week, he's an old man, he's ill, he will pass away at some point, right? And so some of those prayers are just the very Catholic act of praying for someone on the verge of death, on their journey into eternity. And there is something about having that happen in a public way. And I think it's to the Vatican's great credit that they have at least tried to be forthright about the condition of his illness and all of these things, right? There's sort of the famous tradition of Vatican secrecy where the Pope is never sick until he's dead, right? You hear that line. In this case, they haven't done anything like that. And it's comparable in a way, to the witness of Pope St. John Paul II in his last days,
Mm.
suffering from Parkinson's, being sort of a public witness to the faith in a diminished condition, right? And I think that that's actually powerful and important, and why generally, allowing for particular circumstances, it is better for popes to accept that at the end of their reign, they will not be dynamic figures, right? They will not be traveling the world and issuing new encyclicals every week and so on. But that's okay because they aren't part of their mission is not just to be a bureaucratic leader of the faith. It is to be a spiritual father. And I think people are responding to just the idea that just like your real father, your father's your father, God willing, until he dies, right? And the same is true of a pope, and that's a powerful thing.
Ross Douthat is our guest, and he's talking about his book, Believe. And among many things I wanted to bring up was your own journey of belief. When I began this interview program a long, long time ago, my first guest was the film director, Frank Capra. And he talked about the fact that he was baptized into the Catholic Church. But notice when he came to America as an immigrant that the Catholics were not the successful people, that it was Protestants, people of no particular immigration background who seemed to make it in America. So he decided to mainstream it and joined a number of Protestant denominations. Ultimately, he came back to his Catholic faith. He said, for him, the drawback was the invitation back was the Eucharist. He needed the Eucharist, the real presence. Ross, you come from a tradition that is Protestant evangelical, and you made that leap to embrace the Catholic faith with your family. As Capra said, it was the Eucharist for you. What was the draw of Catholicism?
So I had an interesting experience where I converted to Catholicism at about age 17,
Wow.
together with my family, as you mentioned. And so I'm neither a cradle Catholic nor the traditional adult convert, you're in your 40s and you have a mystical or intellectual awakening and so on. I'm somewhere in between. And connected to that is the fact that I sort of participated in a kind of religious quest or pilgrimage that was not my own, that was much more my parents, especially my mother's, but both parents, where I we were in not just Protestant but Pentecostalist and charismatic circles, and I had a lot of exposure to a very direct, immediate kind of mystical experience, healing prayer, speaking in tongues, all of these kind of things. And I think for my parents and my mother especially, there was a kind of mystical bridge there, where you pass from the sort of experience of God in charismatic prayer to the experience of God in the Eucharist, right? Or, reading the mystics and the lives of the saints and seeing some things that you also saw in Protestantism reflected more fully in the life of the church. I am not a mystical personality. I'm very interested in the mystical and supernatural. I write about it. I sort of have, I observe it, but it's not central to my faith in the same way as it is for some people. So I had, in a way, a kind of more conventional intellectual conversion where I read, G.K. Chesterton and the kind of predictable writers that, young, slightly nerdy would-be Catholics read to talk themselves into it. But I also appreciated in Catholicism the sacramental life of the church as a promise that God is there for you, the Holy Spirit is there for you and operating in your life, even if you aren't overcome by mystical experience at any given moment, right? That there is a sense of reliability in confession, in the sacrament of marriage, sacrament of confirmation, all the rest, where the operation of the Holy Spirit is assumed as a reality, without someone, putting their hand on your shoulder and saying, "All right, now, son, can you testify to, to how Jesus has changed your life?" Right? Like at age 17 or 18, I wasn't sure how
Mhm.
Jesus had changed my life. I did believe firmly in God, and yeah, I mean, it's an interesting thing because there are people who have the opposite experience, right? Who are raised Catholic and feel like, oh, it's too impersonal,
Mhm.
right? And they end up in evangelical churches because they feel like it's a more personal
That's right.
connection. But for me, it was sort of the promise that, yeah, that sort of the consistent presence of God is there, even if you aren't feeling it at every single moment. That I found and continue to find reassuring about Catholicism.
Ross talks in his book Believe about many of the beautiful things that his spirituality and his religious nature have brought to him and his family. And that's why I think it's important, especially for a lot of our listeners and watchers who are in the midst of trying to make sense of uh, bringing God into their family and having it matter. I got to ask because you're not only this writer from the New York Times and the author of books like Believe, you're also both husband and dad. So I'm just wondering, is there in your mind the magical bullet that tells us how in the world will we value something like faith? Are we able to introduce it meaningfully into the life of our children?
I mean, so I do have five children, but the oldest is only 14.
Oh,
So I have not yet gone
okay.
fully into the realm of, they haven't gone away to college, they haven't entered fully into adulthood. And so any advice that I give has to come with that caveat, right? That,
Right.
I have no idea how things are going to play out
Sure.
in
We
adult
should check
life.
back with Ross in about 5 years or so.
Well, yeah, no, exactly. But I will say, I mean, what I have tried to do with my kids is actually, everybody's different, right? But you assume that your kids are somewhat like yourself.
Mhm.
And I was always something of a contrarian. I've ended up as a conservative columnist at the New York Times. You don't end up with that vocation if you aren't a bit of a contrarian. And for me, religious faith was always this incredibly powerful and important part of my life as a child. But I also was always in worlds that included lots and lots of non-Christians and non-believers. I watched my parents speaking in tongues on weekends and then went to a nice secular liberal private school where relatively few people believed intensely in God. And I've tried to, in a sense, sort of prepare my children for that kind of world, to teach them, to teach them the Catholic faith, bring them up as Catholics, take Catholicism seriously, tell them that I think it's the full truth about the world, and also always make them aware that they're going to go out into a world, they are already exposed to it in different ways, where lots of people believe a lot of different things.
Hmm.
And your own faith has to exist in that context, right? You have to have a sense of like, okay, why both what does my faith say to challenges that people might pose to it who aren't Catholic? And also, how do I think about non-Catholic religions, other forms of Christianity, other religions, which is also something that I talk a bit about in this book. And that's so I've spent a fair amount of time saying, this is what I believe as your father. This is what you're being brought up to think. And also, these are the arguments and debates that you should be aware of. These are the things that other people believe. Here are some of the arguments they make. In a sense, a kind of, I mean, preparing them, yeah, preparing them for a world where they're not under my roof, not in my control in any way, shape, or form. And the reality is that I don't know how it will work. And as you said, we'll have to check back in 10, but also 20, 30, 40 years, God willing,
It'll keep growing and
to see what
evolving.
God, I mean, you try what you tell yourself, I think, in this kind of era, especially, is that, you do the best you can, and their lives are in their own hands and in God's ultimately. And there's clearly no magic bullet. I have known, the most devout Catholic parents whose children have fallen away. I've
Right.
known, people who are lackadaisical at best in the practice of their faith, whose kids become more intense about it. And you do the best you can, but you have to, yeah, as someone wise once said, all of that worrying is not going to add a single day to your life.
Someone great said that. I had a couple, very worried, a Catholic Jewish couple got married, and will the child end up being Jewish or Catholic? And the child ended up being Buddhist. And they said, "See, God has a plan.
Right.
No one
God.
can reveal." Ross, aside from talking about his children, his five children, is also obviously someone who's married, and together they've made this wonderful family. But I mention it because having the privilege of celebrating weddings every weekend, I don't want to do a canned homily on marriage and love. So each couple that I get a chance to witness also writes me an essay on why, of all the people in the world, this is the one I think that God revealed for me to marry. So I mention that to you because looking back, what, when you married Abigail, was there about her that made you say, in all the world, this is someone I'm probably meant to build a life with?
That was so long ago. Goodness. Decades and decades. I mean, I think that part of it, there is sort of, there is different, there's different layers and levels, right? Like there is basic romantic ardor and sexual
Hmm.
attraction that, especially when you're marrying young, is, I think, essential. It's not sufficient. You can't build a marriage on on sort of youthful attraction alone. But starting in without it is probably a mistake. So you have that level. You have a level of sort of personal compatibility that is, both in terms of values and temperament, um, and interests, and but also, where you're from, who your parents are, even things as basic as where you're going to go on vacation are worth thinking about, right? It's been very helpful to our marriage, for instance, that my mother's family is from Maine, and Abby, my wife, had gone to Girl Scout camp in Maine at various points, and so had had some experience with summer in Maine as a good thing that could be like one of the things we did that, that mattered. We were both from Connecticut, a kind of shared, um, a shared, a shared New England nest. Like those kind of things can be underestimated, I think. But then finally, from a religious perspective too, there's also just a sense where you do, I think, want to be looking for signs and signifiers and indicators um, that you're on the right path, right? That
Hmm.
this isn't just a person who you can be in love with, that this is a person you're supposed to be in love with and supposed to spend your life with. So, after college for a little while, I was in Washington, D.C., and Abby was in upstate New York working at a newspaper up there. And for a while, it was hard to see how exactly our paths were going to intersect in a way that made the relationship work. And then she got offered a job in New Orleans. She was a newspaper reporter with the New Orleans Times Picayune. And of course, that was just before Hurricane Katrina. So if she'd taken that job, she would have ended up having a Pulitzer Prize because the whole paper got a Pulitzer. But also the apartment she was going to rent would have been flooded. So it was, it was just sort of trade-offs. But then at the last minute, just before she was going to take that job, she was suddenly offered an interview in Baltimore at the Baltimore Sun, which was, 45 minutes from me instead of, many, many hours of plane travel. And she went and interviewed for the job and got the job. It was very unexpected and sudden. And, I think looking back, you want to see those kind of things as the brushstrokes of providence,
Hmm.
right? That you want and this is not just true of marriage, it's true of a lot of things. You want to be trying to, follow your heart and make your choices, but also be looking for indicators as you move through life that, okay, God is giving things a little nudge here, right? Um, and a year after she moved to Baltimore, we were engaged, and 9 months after that, we were married. I took the nudge, and here we are. And
That's
she's just
great.
wonderful.
And did she see similar things in you that you're highlighting about her?
I
Uh,
think she saw me as a little bit risky, to be honest. I mean, yeah. I'm joking, but not completely. I was the the editor of the conservative newspaper at Harvard University, which is a slightly peculiar position to be in.
Sure is. Yeah.
And I wouldn't say, yeah, I think, this is the other thing about marriage. It's good to be with someone where you see each other's potential
Hmm.
early, right? And of course, that doesn't work and happen for everyone. And it's also fine to get married after you're settled and established in life. There's nothing wrong with that. Um, but there are great virtues in knowing that your spouse saw you as a awkward, not, not incredibly romantically experienced senior in college and found you attractive then.
Ross Douthat is our guest, and the book is Believe. I must ask you, I go back to that song from a movie way before your time, the movie Love Story, and the theme was, "Where do I begin?" And I think of that in terms of your book. So the person who says, "I haven't been near anything religious, maybe I was baptized, but that's the end of it." But your book very specifically says an answer to the question, like, where do I begin? I want to become a more religious person, but do I go to classes? Do I just drop into a church? Do I read books? What do I do? Where do I begin? Where do I begin, Ross, to think about the possibility? And what is as you raised in the book, what is the benefit of my trying to find my faith and my religious practice?
I mean, so second question first, right? The
Okay.
benefit is that it's very likely that a religious perspective on reality is true. It's very likely that there is a God. It's very likely that you were placed here for a reason, that the cosmos was made with human beings in mind, that there's some integral connection between our consciousness and the order of the universe. And part of my book is just making a case for that reality and saying, look, you know, there's a bias against religious ideas and arguments in our society that's just mistaken. And so the reason to be religious is it's probably is getting at any, a big religion, an ancient religion is probably getting at some true thing about the world that you should want to be in touch with because you're going to die someday and you're going to enter eternity and you're going to have to make an account of your life, right? So that's a basic starting point. As to what you do then, it
Hmm.
depends in part on who you are, right? Like it's very important to my perspective on God, the idea that God is not trying to trick you. He's not out to get you. He's not making it impossible for you. And what that implies is there's probably something in your life that you can connect with that would get you closer to him. And that doesn't necessarily mean that, like, tomorrow you're going to open the mail and there'll be a letter and inside it will say, dear sir, here's your invitation to become a Roman Catholic. Signed God, right? That's
Doesn't
might
work that way.
happen, but
Yeah.
probably not going to work that way. But there probably is some way in for you. And if you're an intellectual person, then I would say, yeah, you might start by reading some books about God, my own to start with, but it's a sort of very basic thing.
Right.
But you can go further than that. If you're literally saying, I don't know which religion to start with, it's okay to just pick up the New Testament and read it alongside with the Quran and the Bhagavad Gita and see what kind of reaction that gets. Right? There are people for whom that's the way to start. But then there are other people where you would say, okay, you must have a friend who's religious. Maybe you don't, but you probably do. You probably have a friend who's religious. Who's your most attractive friend who's religious, right? Or a family member. Or maybe, okay, you're Jewish and your Judaism is sort of attenuated, but you have some connection there. Maybe you should follow that connection, right? And if you got me to the person who had, no interest in reading, no personal connections to religion, then maybe you say, all right, I think you should go. What is the church nearest to you geographically? Go sit in that church for a half hour every day, right? Like, but I think that, obviously, if you sat me down with someone, I would try and convince them that Catholicism is true and that they should be a Catholic. That would be sort of my end game. But I think for a starting place, it's okay to look for, what is the closest thread connecting me to religion? Okay, pick that up and follow it.
I'd like to thank Ross for our listeners and watchers. Ross, how to get Believe? Where do they go to find the book?
Wherever books are sold. I think, if my two forms of advice are, it's probably cheapest on Amazon.com, and there's nothing wrong with ordering it there. If you have a local bookstore that you support, including a Catholic bookstore, it's, maybe more high-minded to go and get it there. And certainly if they don't have it, you can ask them to order it. But if you need it immediately, Amazon.com will serve just fine.
I want to thank you for being on Personally Speaking. I want our folks and listeners and watchers to get Believe. But I just have to tell you, it is a delight for me to, because I do read every day the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, and to see your columns there, to see someone, again, unapologetically a man of faith, a searcher who is also someone who's arrived at a conclusion and is willing to share that, is such a grace for many of us who otherwise might have some suspicions about what is the New York Times doing to me today. I never have suspicions about where you're bringing me, and I'm so grateful for your presence, your witness, your testimony, and for Ross. There we go again.
Douthat's yep.
Douthat's book, Believe, and the subtitle, Why Everyone Should Be Religious. Ross, thanks so much for being with us, and keep on keeping on. You're a great source of hope.
Thank you, Father. God bless. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for being with us on Personally Speaking. If you need to reach me, you can do that at personallyspeakingpodcast@gmail.com. You probably listened to this program on SiriusXM, the Catholic channel, 129, but you can also watch the program on YouTube by searching under Personally Speaking with Monsignor Jim Lisante. I'm privileged to serve as host and executive producer of Personally Speaking. Our producer is Lisa Janovich. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll be with you again next time on Personally Speaking.